Hi, everybody. It's the great John Steppling who was here with us about a month ago, but we're going to have another little chat with John today. We're just starting to get going last time, and
Yeah,
probably add some more things to the mix. But where we were sort of leaving off was on the question of modeling. And it actually at the time reminded me of remarks of Husserl in his Crises of the European Sciences, his characterization of Galilean science and its efforts to mathematicize nature. The mathematicization of nature, while useful, is also a reduction of nature to a specific set of terms, which
yeah,
actually broadly evacuates our experience of the real. Um, but it's a powerful impression, and it suffuses our culture that we've almost sort of lost touch with that distinction. There's a tendency to see the mathematical as simply coeval or identical with the real, and it also connects with the problem of information as a concept and the digital as a concept. And you took up some of these themes from a different vantage. I was reviewing your essay before we got on here. Which one was the doomed to succeed? That one, right? Doomed to succeed. You draw a lot on James Gleichen there. Um,
hmm
and some other, but just as a point of departure, the notion of climate modeling and the problems of climate modeling. I found the point you made about the vastness of the earth as something which is largely forgotten, an interesting one.
Well, yeah, um, that's become kind of um, one of the phrases that is becoming associated with me. Uh, but it's interesting. The We're doing this on a on the internet and via Zoom, and my speakers are bad, so I have headphones on. And I always get very headphones always make me slightly paranoid. So I always end up slipping one to the side so I can hear the ambience of the room. So whenever I'm filmed with headphones, I look like a crazy person because I have headphones.
I mean, just
Um,
that look.
anyway, but I mention this because I was thinking a lot after you invited me graciously to do another one of these. Uh, I was thinking a lot about theater, and Johan and I are doing a workshop in Uppsala in October. I hope the first of many. And he and I were talking about there's a documentary from 2005, I think, called Into Great Silence, I believe is the title. It's a German documentarian who went to I should actually get the exact date for it here, into this monastery. Let me find the exact, hold on. It's a remarkable 2005, um, a, Car- a monastery of Carthusian monks, and there's a kind of vow of silence, and uh, their days are very regimented. And he had made a request something like 11 or 12 years earlier to the head of the abbey, who replied, "Well, it's a little early, maybe later." And then, because I think time passes differently in the monastery, called him something like 16 years later and said, I think we can do it now. The filmmaker said, "Oh, okay, yeah." And he rushed to do it. And it's a remarkable documentary. Now, uh, I mention this for several reasons because Johan and I share this fascination with, I mean, he's a practicing Catholic, I'm not, but since I was a young man, the appeal of uh, of retreat, of monasteries, not of becoming a mendicant, but the monasterial monk life. People always think I'm kidding. It's enormously appealing to me. People say, "Oh, well, you could never do it." Well, when I was in my 20s, no, probably not. I liked girls too much, probably. But as time has passed, uh, it becomes more and more compelling. And so I suggest people watch this film. But there's a number of topics related to, to this film, to the idea of a monasterial life, about silence. Uh, One is architectural. If you've ever been in old monasteries, the ruins of monasteries, uh, they all share a certain quality, that they're very cool. There's never they're never stuffy or heaved. They understood something about architecture. The walls are thick, so they're very quiet anyway. There's a sense of things being balanced and in proportion. And people have said to me when this topic has come up in the past, people say, "Well, but do you believe in God? Are you religious?" And I said, "Well, I don't belong to a church. No. Um, how could you become a Carthusian monk? Uh, I don't know. And at this point, it's not likely to happen. But to me, I knew monks in Thailand. I find that, and it's interesting because Thai boys are obligated to go into the monastery for, I don't know, 6 months or a year or something when they're younger, much like there's an obligatory military service in European countries. Uh, what they meditate on, what Tibetan Buddhists meditate on, what Jainists, Hindu monks meditate on, I don't know if they call monks, what the Benedictines or Carthusians or Cistercians or Trappists, whatever. All of these different orders, all of these different religions, the Coptic monks in the desert who are a direct lineage to the desert fathers of antiquity, they're all doing the same thing. And to me, it's very directly related to theater. It's also very directly related. I mean, I bring all of this up as a preface to this this pathogenic capitalism that we live with and under and in. And it is, if one asks me, well, what is it that you're meditating on? It's God. What's God? So let me step back from that question and approach it from another perspective. Trust me, I'm getting to a point here. Freud, in one of his essays, talked about the thing, das Ding, I think it is in German. And he only mentions it in passing, but Lacan became very obsessed with it. For Freud, it was this trace memory, but it's not really a memory, this archaic, primordial something that, Jung would call it some element of the collective unconscious. It's something there that, to me, is our awareness of being human. And this is why, to me, this stuff is related to theater. I actually came across a quote interestingly, of Kafka's, of Walter Benjamin. Benjamin, in his essay on Kafka, said, Kafka's world is a world theater. For him, man is on the stage from the very beginning. This is what I think, and I've had a few essays where because I became very fascinated with cave paintings at Lascaux and stuff. Herzog made a documentary, a number of people, and John Berger wrote about this. And if you will forgive me one other quote here, Berger wrote the best thing I've ever read on those cave paintings. And he said these rock paintings were made where they were, these paintings were made where they were so that they might exist in the dark. They were for the dark. They were hidden in the dark so that what they embodied would outlast everything visible and promise, perhaps, survival. Close quote. There's another quote. For me, if you try to imagine what life was like for Cro-Magnon man, or the various cave dwellers who were nomadic, and Berger points out that process, those paintings, those caves were visited for like 20,000 years, where nothing changed because they painted over the previous paintings, and they returned for a reason. I don't imagine Cro-Magnon man had a lot of spare time, so they didn't paint when they were hungry. They painted when they were not hungry, but it had some importance. And they did it in the dark, and they often did it in parts of the cave that were very difficult to get to. And people always say, well, and this was the beginning of religion because people were idols of religious ritual, and I don't think that's true at all. Leroy Goran, thinks it was the beginning of a kind of visual alphabet of some sort, the beginning of speech. I think perhaps that's true, but it was the beginning of human awareness as a human, that one day, as you stepped out of the dark into the light, you realized something. There was something. I think it's Didier Anzou says, thinking requires, how does he put it? I forget. There are unthought thoughts, in a sense. That's what this was. That's the beginning of theater, I think. I think that was true for Kafka and Benjamin, too. That's the idea. And that's why theater is so important and subversive, and why it's linked to the tragic and to death and all kinds of things. Anyway, all of this is to say that I think the contemporary life under capitalism has become increasingly intolerable because all of these linkages, all of this sense of the history of the human are to Shakespeare, I think it was Bloom said it was the invention of the human, which is the single good thing he ever said. But it's true, and we live in a society that has just lost all that. And my wife's family has a dairy farm here. My boys, who are 6 years old, twins, the other one's 4, they love to go to see their uncle at the dairy farm and see the cows, and they walk around. There's amazing smells and sounds. It's very evocative. And I was thinking of the Dutch farmers and the Belgian farmers now, perhaps German farmers too, Irish as well. They're culling cattle, they're shutting down these farms. Well, they're not just destroying an industry, they're doing that as well. They're probably intentionally destroying national economies. But they're destroying culture and history by doing that as well. It, to me, there's a sense when I go to that farm and I walk around with my sons, and there are these sounds and smells, and this is life, and it's food, and it's history. It's in the same category as the Carthusian abbey in the mountains. And I feel it's in the same it's in the same realm of things that are being destroyed. And I think these things are being destroyed before our eyes right now. That's what I think is so depressing in a sense. So, uh, you know, I will end this particular long speech right here. But is this the result? Is this the turn of the Enlightenment? Is this logical positivism? Is this the mathematizing of everything, the computational logic? I don't know, but I suspect on some level that it is. But
Well,
how and why that happened, that's complicated.
I think that the connection is relatively intimate between the arising of mathematical reasoning as hegemonic and where we find ourselves. But that's almost sort of like a secondary level. I think the primary question becomes one of power or even pride. So as you were speaking, you sort of set like three terms here. There's the, you talk about the theatrical, and then you talked about the dairy farm, you talk about, or farming in general, you talk about the monastic, but one denominator, which, and it's kind of ironic, I'm using a metaphor derived from mathematics, right? Right. The common denominator is the exigency of humbleness with reference to those terms, right? All of those domains evoke a sense of humility when they are successfully engaged, right? And another denominator is embodiment, that there is a sense of, the incarnate, the flesh, you're getting your hands dirty as a farmer, and it's sort of ironic, right? That you would find this, you would think, well, that seems kind of ethereal monasticism, but the life of a monk is actually a life of saying that you can't escape your body as a monk, because what happens is you are deprived of distraction. That's the real essence of asceticism. It deprives you of distraction. It compels you to confront your finitude, and that finitude arises perhaps in one of the most essential ways vis-a-vis the corporeal. And then as far as the theatrical goes, when it would, and I haven't been deeply engaged with the theater as you have, so I'm speaking at a certain amateur remove. But what strikes me is that successful theater uh, chastens the audience because it compels them to encounter a part of themselves which they probably would rather not encounter, which might be the distinction between mere entertainment and genuine drama or comedy. Even comedies can be uncomfortable because sometimes we don't want to admit our capacity for joy either. So, so, uh, so where does this connect with the issue of power? It connects with the issue of power is that, uh, in some regards, the uh, fountainhead of the Enlightenment, uh, bloody, yeah, I should have silenced my device, is characterized by a deep hostility for our contingency. You see that in Bacon, see that in Descartes, and even interestingly, there's an antecedent articulation of this hostility in Machiavelli, whom I've come to appreciate recently as having more of a role to play in the diabolical features of modernity. Um, so where does math fit in all that? Well, math, because it puts us in touch with certain evidences, certain certitudes, uh, superficially as a counterpoint to that contingency and can be yoked to a project of mastery. Of course, that's also bad math because anyone who goes deeply into math, inevitably encounters mystery there as well. But uh, that's actually encountering mathematics as opposed to technique. What happens under the project of the enlightenment is that mathematics is harnessed rather than engaged. It'd be a component to essentially a project of technical mastery. So it's actually not even it's and hence you see all the idea of applied mathematics, blah 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 blah. No one really wants to look into the infinity of a set and sort of really like sit with that. All right. Instead, it's like, oh, well, what can we do with this as a technique, which is sort of a bastardization of our access to that facet of being, which is as human beings is something of a privilege, I think. I mean, I don't have access to the subjectivity of a bat, a la Thomas Nagel, but I feel that as a human being, I have access to certain mathematical realities which other species perhaps do not. And this is, in fact, a privilege, but it's a privilege which, in my view, is bastardized isn't the right word. You know, it's demeaned.
No, but yeah.
It's almost a form of sacrilege. So it's the
Well,
way in which we invoke mathematics, right? It would actually make Pythagoras blush.
the idea of humility is, I think, a really keen observation and an important observation, and it's true. Uh, and and it's not something I have written about specifically, and now I want to, uh, because I think that's true. And the interesting question becomes, where did that go? One of the things that has happened over, say, the last 20 years, and maybe 30 years, and accelerated as the internet became so ubiquitous and the West began to be so completely dependent on internet technology and social media and all these things. But this thing that has occurred over this last 30 years has been an absolute increase in two things that are related. One is a growing aggression. People are extraordinarily aggressive on the internet, on social media. You have stalkers. I mean, I have. People pick fights, insanely angry comments. Uh, I am a big fan of basketball, and there's a few writers that I read, David Thorpe and John Hollinger. And every once in a long while, I will make a comment. And they just had summer league, and I made a comment the other day, and I said, I don't believe these guys, these two twin brothers, are going to be as good as everybody thinks. I said, but maybe I'm missing something. It was a very moderate and you know, I kept saying, I don't know, but here's entertain this idea, blah blah. The next day I went back and there's like 10 comments when people say, you're just a fucking idiot. What's the matter? Are you blind? What's it? And I thought, but I just had a different opinion about this one tiny thing, and I voiced it in an incredibly nice way. But this is very telling. This People are triggered into rage over nothing, and I think especially on the internet. But this is tied in, I believe, to the loss of this humility we're talking about that is linked to history and tradition and the rituals and memory, collective memory of these things. This dairy farm my wife's brother runs now, his father ran it before him. It defines that family in a sense. And every farmer I've ever known, the farm I've gone to, there was a sense of family lineage and history. And so the government's now coming in and just saying, well, cows fart too much, and it's CO2 and it is global. And so we're going to slaughter cattle, destroy your family identity, your cultural heritage, because we're pretty certain our computer models are correct. And fuck you if they're not anyway, because that's what we're going to do. Now,
I mean, so if I can interrupt.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Just because, and I mean, part I'm just being emotional, reactive.
All right, let's jump into it, because I don't think that's more than.
It just,
So let's want to bring.
it's so radically dishonest what's occurring. It's radically dishonest. The relationship with the land, which is being fostered, agriculture, and even the narrative of anthropogenic induced climate change is serving as this despicable idol to justify actions which are actually, in many cases, concretely damaging to the land.
Yeah, of course.
There's this. It's a spectacle, right? And it's served also by the fact that we are removed from the land, because most people are so removed by dint of this manifestly horrid system which we find ourselves ensconced. They are made gullible. They don't. They're credulous is probably a better word. They're credulous because they don't have a connection, a concrete connection with the reality. I don't. By the way, I'm not.
Well,
right. And then there's one other thing that occurred to me though. It's sort of like the ironies of certain things, right? You talk about the slaughter of cattle. And on one level, this is often framed in a utilitarian way, but the biblical notion of or the ancient notion of the hecatomb sort of occurs, where you have these people slaughtering animals en masse, and it's kind of sacrifice that is being used to invoke their own gods, right? And it's a different relationship with the gods that which some people may think I like sound crazy. I don't care. All right, as far as I'm concerned, those who occupy the commanding heights, even if they don't think about it explicitly in these terms, they are also involved in a religious project that is fundamentally it's fundamentally religious. I'll just leave it at that. And destruction of certain things is a sign of that. So.
Yeah, and there's two things. I mean, one is industrial farming isn't being shut down. These are family farms. These are small farms. Mass, huge, horrifying, mass industrial food production isn't, and which is just ghastly and criminal and sadistic, isn't being touched. And the other thing is, these countries are cheerleading this war. They are embracing their government buying more weapons, admittedly junk that nobody else wants, and they're shipping it off to Ukraine. But there's none of this kind of new woke environmentalism ever pay attention to the fact that there's war going on, and that's just a wee bit environmentally negative. Greta Thunberg, little Nazi elf that she is, goes and visits Zelensky. There's a photo op. I mean, this is, you just think, I can't make this up. You know, it's so grotesque. But anyway, but I want to get back to, because you said a couple of things that were important to expand on. First is architecture. When you talk about Machiavelli, and it's very interesting. Manfredo Tarfuri never wrote very much. One book and a couple essays, Italian Marxist architect. And he has a beautiful essay on Piranesi. In fact, I'm going to read you another very small quote, because this is directly connected. The Carceri, the etchings of Piranesi. Tarfuri says, in these etchings, the Carceri, the space of the building, the prison, is an infinite space. What has been destroyed is the center of that space, signifying the correspondence between the collapse of ancient views of the ancient order and the totality of the disorder, reason, the author of this destruction, a destruction Piranesi felt to be fatal. It's transformed into irrationality. But the prison, precisely because infinite, coincides with human existence, close quote. I had this in a blog post, and I wrote after that, alienation is the state of the collective. What is it that haunts one when viewing the Carceri? I would submit it is exactly this ruinous uncanny that is triggered when the volume of empty space reaches a certain point. The sense of anxiety is connected to the silence of things. For Tarfuri, the architecture of the Enlightenment is an expression of compensation for the anguish of a system of empty signs. The buildings of the Enlightenment are tinged with guilt, close quote on me there. I think that you have to kind of be familiar with Piranesi's work, but he was transcribing something in those etchings that again is this archaic something. There's a religious quality to that search. And it was the exact thing that was being lost with the Enlightenment. And of course, that wrong turn has, under capitalism, and we can get into that, accelerated enormously to now pathological levels, pathogenic levels, where it's a constant assault on the human. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you were reading that quote, if I heard it correctly, what struck me is especially the moment about removing the center. Right? So it's not just a question of vastness or infinity, or it's actually the fact that there's no point of orientation. Everything is kind of erased, and you have perfect homogeneity, which is actually when you take entropy and draw entropy to its fullest expression. Its fullest expression, informationally and otherwise, is complete homogeneity. So the irony is that there's nothing more vertiginous than a completely homogeneous space. What I think is interesting is that these are sort of, we're appealing here to the spatial facet of our experience, but it, I think, is linked also to the temporal destruction of our experience, the loss of history. So history has some sense of a ground, right? There is a narrative, there is something like an anchor which structures the unfolding of time. But under the auspices of the scientific project and the facets of mathematical reasoning which that project inflects, I'm increasingly impressed at how the very notion of the historical is being just utterly extinguished. It's
Yeah,
remarkable.
yeah.
We
No, and it's
uh,
massively important and massively harmful
and
to
there
the
is actually that
construction of history.
point of connect then with the idea of resurrecting, if it's possible, the theatrical. Or the theater is a space of embodiment, potentially, I don't know, which can call us back to a sense of orientation. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, let me say a couple things about theater. Um, there's an interesting book, and I'll do a little plug for this book called Outlaw Theater, and I have an essay in it, but it's what is the subtitle is Field Notes from the Padua Hills Festival, which I was part of for 14 years. It started by Murray Mednick and Irene Forness, Sam Shepard, a lot of people involved. And it was outdoors and so on. Anyway, there's an essay in there, and it talks about some of this by me, but there's a wonderful essay by Martin Epstein as well, and Guy Zimmerman's piece is very good. And at the time, I was beginning to understand. Mednick always says theater is text, and you know, in Shakespeare's time, they said, "Let's go listen to the new play down at the Globe." They didn't say, "Let's go see the play." Let's go listen to the new play. It's a concentrated listening. Now, in theater,
That's a lovely
and
phrase.
Herbert Blau is another theorist, one of the last Americans to write seriously about theater. In theater, the real energy, the juice, the unconscious id is off stage. What's on stage is the representation of something that's being fed by this off stage. And I always use the example that if you take children to the theater for the first time, at intermission, they invariably run up to look in the wings, see what's just off stage, because they sense that's where it's happening. In Greek tragedy, there's always emissaries from elsewhere that run on stage and say, all this shit is happening, and you know, blah blah blah. There's a war going on, and when I have new information, I'll come back, and off they run again. And then there's a dozen pages of long speeches about that, and then the messenger returns again. Pinter understood this. Beckett understood it. Genet, read the screens, absolutely understood this. The revolution was off stage. The nobody taught. If you go to a university in the U.S., nobody at the theater department, no professor speaks this way about theater. They don't talk about theater this way. MFA programs have killed theater. I mean, among many other forces at work, but because they return to something that is inherently anti-transformative. Theater should be an awakening of something. It's not an instruction manual. It's not information. It's not even communication. And I get arguments sometimes with students. I'll say, it's not, well, what are you doing in this play? Well, I just want to communicate something. No, communication is banal, actually. And IKEA instruction kits for your table are that's communicating something. But theater should be something else. And what it's tied to, and this would become a long 2 or 3 podcasts onto itself, is a discussion of the tragic. And Benjamin is great talking about the tragic. It's a revealing of something in time. But Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, like I could say a lot, right? Like, first of all, you're reminding me in terms of like the offstage, onstage tension. This is just a throwaway remark about how whenever I happen to like see some sort of contemporary television show or a lot of film, it's, they're usually just awful. And one of the things that awful about them is that there's so much exposition. There's
Yes.
no behind the scenes. And in fact, that actually makes them more dishonest. Okay.
Yeah. No.
Right.
No.
So there's a contrast between the manner in which that that just struck me. It just sort of like throw away around. Well,
Well, no, but it's true. I mean, I've
I don't
taught
know,
I've taught
everything,
playwriting
but
for years, and every time, the first thing when a student hands in a play, young writer, invariably, I don't think there's been an exception to this in my entire life. You look at it, and the first thing is, okay, you can start this 10 pages in to what you have. Get rid of the 10 pages of exposition and introduction, because that's not the play. The play starts somewhere here. And the student will invariably say, but the audience will be confused. I said, that's fine. Confusion's fine. And audiences are usually actually smarter than you think. They will catch up, and you are communicating much more than you think by just having actors on stage. They don't have to say anything. They don't have to deliver this expository speech about,
in fact,
8 p.m. and the maid is not home.
even
This became, but this became how, and now of course this kind of representational theater, very superficial theater, is linked to this identity politics and a kind of insistence on very obvious themes with quotes around it. That this is about whatever, this is about exploring gender boundaries or something. I mean, you hear this kind of stuff all the time.
so
If you took a play of Pinter's, if you took The Homecoming or The Dumbwaiter, and you said, what is this play about? You would have a very hard time coming up with a 3-sentence definition or explanation of what that play is about, because it's about so much, and so much that is elusive and ephemeral, but therein is the meaning. Now,
can I
you're quite right. Hollywood film turns out junk. I'm sorry, but we should note that, I mean, there was a time when there were filmmakers who made films that at least approached something like what great theater does. I don't think it ever quite reaches that, but was it Elizabeth Ludnesco said of Hitchcock, he films love scenes like murder scenes and murder scenes like love scenes. And that just popped into my head. But you Bresson and Fassbinder and Antonioni and whoever you want,
say there are two
Bozzi,
things
etc.
that
They're
strike me.
doing something very different. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
One is, and or you're saying how, well, you don't want to be concerned with communication because communication is the now. But what strikes me about that remark, that mere communication is the now, is how it reflects the extent to which we have assimilated an informatic sense of what communication is. That communication is just a matter of translation and transformation and then retranslation, right? That it's, and that, and we as a consequence have an incredibly diminished sense of what's occurring, a reductive, positivistic sense of what's occurring with language. And it's, to me, utterly inadequate, preposterous,
So like the UI UX stuff, for example,
again,
you know,
dishonest to one's own experience of language and what happens when you have an encounter with another person or persons. When you, the
but maybe not, right? But,
communication
like,
it engages so much more than just what is informatically present. I'll say informatic as opposed to semiotic, because with semiotic you have the sense of meaning, which is greater than uh, something that Gottlieb Frege would understand, right? You know, so
Yeah, yeah.
um, so we have to maybe revisit what we mean when we say we communicate, and then as a second point, then this is a lamentably pragmatic point. How does one like draw people back to the theater? Because it's not something which is generally engaged anymore. Or at least that is my impression. Sorry to say, I'd be happy to be countered on that point.
Well, this is a topic that I have discussed with a number of people. One of the aesthetic resistant podcasts way back. I talked with Martin Epstein about this, who was involved with Padua and is a very fine playwright and a really pretty brilliant critic. But even Padua, and this is the 1980s, we were able to get sold out audience of 200 people every night, driving 2 hours out to this outdoor location in the foothills outside Claremont. And that audience is gone today. Nobody would do that anymore. So people profoundly have lost the skills for discernment, for judgment, because they can't know something they've never been exposed to. Nobody's ever taught most of today's audience public about uh, the meaning of art and culture. I mean, it becomes a question of what we expect from artists, and uh, it's it's very difficult. You have to. I mean, Johan and I, give you another plug. We eventually hope to form what we in shorthand right now call the People's University, about a lot of things: philosophy and critical theory and theology, but also maybe perhaps primarily art and culture, politics by extension. Because if you look, I worked in Hollywood for 15 years. You know, I know the people involved. I know what they want, and it's worse now. Occasionally, a good film gets made, but because once upon a time, Hollywood studios, because for a variety of reasons, made good films sometimes, and they don't anymore. It has become utterly jingoistic, pro-military, hyper-patriotic uh, shorthand, and and I was once a staff writer on a comedy show, believe it or not. I was not invited back to do any comedy writing, but one of the things we would talk about at staff meetings was the rhythm is really important, because people will laugh at the joke if the rhythm is familiar and the same as previous jokes. Two is tragic, three is funny. Jokes are premised on the punchline coming in the third example. Things like that. So you could record a show. I'm convinced you could film a show in Albanian and put it on prime time, and most people would probably not notice it was in Albanian, because everything else, it's like pattern recognition. The way people read today, because of the internet largely, is they scan things. and it's very fragmentary. And so when you watch, I mean, my Lord, look at the new TV shows every season that come out. They are duplicates of previous shows. I mean, they are almost identical. The actors are often the same. It is, there's a certain comfort in it, obviously, for people. And I understand in terms of mysteries, crime fiction and crime film, there is a certain deeper level at which that operates, I think, that perhaps the creators are completely unaware of. And
Well, the other
and
thing,
that's a whole separate topic. But in general, they are making films that are like amusement park rides. They are not meant to be investigated very attentively or very deeply, and they're not meant to upset the buying potential of the audience. I mean,
so
if you go into a theater to see Orson Welles' Othello, you leave the theater at the mall, you don't want to stop and buy a new pair of sneakers because you're too fucked up. But if you see Mission Impossible, you leave the theater presumably, slightly brain damaged and therefore susceptible to all the shiny objects, and you buy some of them. Yeah, go ahead. No.
I mean, it's just in terms of like skeletons in my closet. I have like a soft spot for like 70s procedural dramas, right? Like Columbo and those Mannix, there's so on and so forth, right? But like, and I'm not saying that these are like great art, right? But if I look at them and I contrast like what's happening in Columbo with like CSI Los Angeles, I'm like, it's just like, no. I mean, there's actually kind of like a subversiveness, I think, to Columbo, which I greatly enjoy. But the other thing that happens if you watch any of those old series over their whole course, since I tend to do that, is they will repeat plots. You're like, that happened in season 1, but there's a variation on this theme. So you can do that. You can vary themes, and then that variation sometimes actually captures something effectively. But that's not what's happening. It's just mechanical. It's formulaic, and it's the extent to which it's degenerative receives testimony from the fact that you're at a point where they can almost just turn the script writing over to a machine like they're trying to do.
Right.
And the very fact that that's possible indicates the extraordinary
Well,
insipidity of the whole matter. So anyway,
the idea that studios are exploring AI, your chat box, whatever it is, to write scripts is not surprising, because that's what they've been instructing screenwriters to do for 20 years, is to write like a chat box. They just didn't know it. Look, if you look at a classic noir, which in the 40s, made by mostly Jewish emigres to Hollywood, German Jews fleeing fascism, and but a film like what's the one that Bogart and Faulkner had a hand in, and Raymond Chandler had a hand in. Those films often don't make sense, even if you dissect them. Things don't add up. Because that's not what they were about. They were about something else that was much more human and peculiar and uncanny. Hitchcock, on the surface, Hitchcock looks like, oh, he's the master of suspense. He's making these. It happened that they were commercially viable, but they're very strange films. They're very, very strange films, and profound films, really. but uh, uh, a lot of the film noir, the stuff that Val Lewton produced for RKO, which was very low budget, and he was left alone, and he had a stable directors, Jacques Tourneur, and I forget the names of the other ones, but stuff like I Walked with a Zombie and Leopard Man and Catwoman. I mean, they're extraordinary films. They're, and Jeffrey O'Brien said, they're really not mysteries. They're really not horror films. They're symbolist poems. I always thought that description was very good. But you don't have that kind of freedom anymore. The film ended at decent, independent kind of auteur cinema died in the 70s. And I've probably mentioned this before. I mean, I've talked
So
about it
do
a
you
lot.
think that
In
we're
1
being a
week,
bit- what? Go ahead.
well, just Friedkin did Sorcerer, and it was the big budget film. It was supposed to be the first of a trilogy, and the studio spent a ton of money on it. It was a remake of a great French film called Wages of Fear, and it came out the same week as Star Wars, as it happened. And Star Wars was a massive, unimaginable hit, and Sorcerer was a massive flop. And the studio since then went, aha, we have our template. It is Star Wars. It is infantile and made for kids, adult kids, and forget this sorcerer film that is dark and strange and depressing, in which there's nobody to root for and so forth. And that killed it. That was really the end. Nothing produced since then by Hollywood studios, with one or two rare exceptions, has been any good at all. But yeah, the culture industry. But these beg bigger questions, and it goes back to what does art and culture mean in Western society today? One might argue it doesn't even exist, of course, but it's certainly not what it meant 75 years ago or 100 years ago. We have this whole trajectory of modernism that, presumably sort of ended in the 60s or something.
So do you, so to go back to Ben-Hami, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm just spitballing here, but I really just find his essay, even though I know it's quoted all over the place and it's been a bit hackneyed, right? But the framework he sets up in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, in terms of the desecration of culture,
Yeah.
is this the problem that with the capacity to replicate, to multiply en masse objects of cultural expression, you have actually undermined the foundation upon which historical culture arises? And is this why we're at a place where culture is virtually void of its historical significance, because
Yes.
there's no longer a capacity to authentically, at least from the standpoint of the tools with which the culture equips people in general, I think that there's still a capacity for the individual to enter into this relationship with art. But the way that the culture equips the individual, you have lost the capacity to authentically appreciate the singularity of a cultural expression and that to which that cultural expression ties you, right? Is it so? So it's the problem. I mean, the problem of reproduction then is connected to the issues of the commodity and commodity grounded alienation and all that, right? But in terms of like the loss of cultural meaning, do you think that Ben-Hameen was onto it there? And or what did he miss if he was
No,
on
yes, that essay has been over analyzed probably and referred to too much. But yeah, I think he's exactly right. And I have had debates over the course of the last year, for some reason, about the Frankfurt School. Benjamin wasn't, strictly speaking, part of it, but he was close to all the people involved. But all the Frankfurt School writers, Adorno and Horkheimer and Ernest Bloch and Marcuse,
Didn't you do it years like
they're a
there was a
pardon?
postscript, wasn't there? You were talking about Marcuse, weren't you?
Yeah.
In a recent, and you actually did a postscript. Maybe talk a little bit about that imbroglio and its relevance to this
Well,
current.
yeah, well, I was going to, funnily enough, because I've been having this debate with a lot of people on the left and people not on the left who also hate the Frankfurt School. Oh, it's cultural Marxism, a term, an empty term. But the first essay I saw was Gabriel Rockhill, and Ben Norton did a YouTube interview recently, and attacking Adorno and say, oh, he's pro-capitalist, he's an anti-communist, and they worked for the CIA and all of this stuff. And on our podcast, I provided a bunch of links, background to this story, because it's not true and they didn't. And
Well, it's
but like, the point, yeah, go ahead.
It's just like to say those things about Adorno, and I actually don't particularly care for Adorno, but to make those allegations betrays that you have not read him. All right. If you had read him, that doesn't mean you would agree with him, but you wouldn't be making these allegations.
No, right.
And
but that's exactly right.
And maybe they did read them and they just had the inability to assimilate his language, because that's another problem, is that people don't know how to read anymore.
That's a huge problem.
So they might read Adorno, like, or probably just an excerpt from some anthology, and then they don't understand it. They don't understand.
Well, if you want to have, there's an interesting dialogue I have with one of my readers on my blog, George MC. I don't know his name, but he's a very smart guy, and it's on the blog post. The android's anxiety, and he was questioning some stuff about Adorno, and we had an interesting, very good natured, friendly dialogue about it. And one of the points was that Adorno's really impossible to read, incredibly dense, and probably untranslatable. I mean, the people who have translated him, and Robert Hugh Kenter was the best with what he did in aesthetic theory, but he is incredibly hard to translate, and the translations take forever. You'd probably be better off learning German and read it in the original instead of waiting for the translation. That's one problem. He's very difficult. People don't have the background. They don't read. They don't. This goes back to this loss of skills, of judgment and reason and discernment. Adorno said a great thing. He said to argue taste is essential, because for him, judgments of taste was a moral question. These were moral judgments. It was that serious to him, and that's what he wrote about. But anybody, any of the Frankfurt School writers, and probably any of the major philosophers we can think of over the last 150 years, would agree with that what you just said earlier, that vis-a-vis the Benjamin article, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, that yes, we are seeing a complete collapse, just a total sort of cascading removal of culture from the Western psyche. People don't have any idea where to begin, and I understand that. And this is why Johan and I want this People's University. I mean, it's a small step towards saying, okay, come and start to learn how to read seriously, how to make judgments based on some sort of historical precedent, some at least historical understanding, an understanding that history exists. I mean, that Tarfuri quote about Piranesi is very important. And my follow-up, because I was paraphrasing Tarfuri, I don't want to take credit for it, but it's like the empire of empty signs, as somebody said, because we have no rituals in Western society that have any meaning. We have rituals, but they're empty. They're done by rote. They're mechanical. So
Well, they lose the
there's
power
no.
if they're not consciously.
Say what?
Yep. They're rituals by accident. You're not
Yeah,
intentional. And so, like, you could look at like rites of passage in the US, there's like a vague echo of that in getting one's driver's license, but I'd hardly call it a ritual. All right. It's a bureaucratic act. It's a bureaucratic accident that, and
well, you know what's, there's another issue here vis-a-vis this, because it impinges on the entire discussion. Because I want to get back to why I think there's such hostility to the Frankfurt.
yes, please forgive me.
But it's this idea of progress that really was born of the Enlightenment. And if you go back and you read John Locke or any number of others, productivity was synonymous with virtue, and productivity meant progress, expansion. And we live under that umbrella still, that and this goes back to computer modeling too. I mean, all of these agendas, these official discourses that are created by the government, the ruling class, whoever, this stuff is tied into fundamentally a very rigid, inflexible belief in progress and productivity, that we're working towards something better and bigger. And it's this loss of humility again, too. And so
to the present.
And so this, I'm sorry, I'm so deaf.
No,
What?
There's this hostility. I mean, that's quite like, I hadn't made that connection myself that you're making about how the notion of progress is tied to this ambient cultural hostility. And there's, what I was saying is that there's an animosity. There's an animosity toward the present, to where we are right now.
I hope there's not an internet. Yeah, I missed some of that, but I get your drift. Let me just comment, because it may be that the internet where I am, I'm down in the cabin here, is getting interrupted. But the hostility to the Frankfurt School is also, there's like a secondary hostility to Marx, a hostility to Freud. All of these thinkers that are suggesting something pessimistic, perhaps, although, as Ulo Kender said, the claim that somebody is pessimistic is a more pessimistic act than pessimism you're accusing them of. Because nobody wants to accept the idea that this progress that everyone so believes in, this productive expansionist progress toward a future, and we can talk about defining what is posited as the future, but that all of this might carry with it the seeds of regression, of a kind of latent barbarism that was supposed to be what the Enlightenment was a corrective for. And of course, as you know, all the Frankfurt School writers noted, since Auschwitz, it's very hard to believe in the idea of progress anymore because we have sunk to the lowest state of absolute barbarism now. And how did that happen? And of course, then we have a discussion about capitalism and a system predicated on exploitation and inequality that manufactures poverty. And I mean, look at the state of America today, the United States today. Look at the levels of homelessness, inequality that is exceeding, the days of Boss Tweed. I mean, and it is so irrational and so insane that the United States is sending billions of dollars to fight a war that's pointless and and incurs a suffering of an entire nation and a fantasy, delusional foreign policy that is imperialist and absolutely failed, except for if you work for the defense industry. But that somehow, in the face of all of this, people can so effectively compartmentalize their thinking and not see these things and insist that socialism is bad, communism is bad, capitalism is the only solution, and blah blah blah. All of these things that we've heard and known about and talked about, that this people's knee-jerk reaction follows this particular track. Those philosophers and thinkers, people like Adorno, who were devoted and spent 40 years transcribing the psychic effects, the human suffering of capitalism. They're going to be accused of being anti-communist or somehow agents of the CIA or something. It's just amazing. But propaganda, and you could spend hours discussing propaganda because it has been, especially today, right now, remarkably effective. I mean, remarkably effective. You just have to look at the Ukraine-Russia conflict to see a concerted, conscious, intentional demonizing of Russia, a complete rewriting of the facts, a complete propaganda that creates this infantile, simplistic storyline that I guess is all that people can digest today, a lot of people. Now, having said all that, I'm always quick to point out that it's not everyone, though. I mean, you and I are having this conversation. There are protests all over the world against this stuff, often working class protests. The farmers in Holland are not going quietly with these new edicts. The French state is under siege because a lot of people have reached a point where they have nothing to lose, and they may not be able to articulate political theory, but they understand that this system is exploitive and unfair, and that what legacy media, so-called mainstream media, the corporate media, lies, as do governments, all the time. So we live in a reality in which the forces of authority lie constantly and do not care about your life or my life, right? And how does one digest that fact? It's not conducive to mental health, and then hence we have a quarter of the population on antidepressants because things don't add up, because there are contradictions that are ultimately impossible to reconcile, and so we're in this state, this precarious state, of, uh, of a sort of societal madness right now, I think.
Well, I would agree. Obviously, we're having this conversation, right? I mean, what occurs to me is that part of the reason that propaganda is so successful right now is that it's building on previous successes. If
Yeah.
if American and the world's historical consciousness had not already been dramatically mutilated by the contests of discord which occur probably mostly through the 80s, starting in the late 70s, 80s, if they had not so effectively destroyed people's sense of the past, they would not be able to do what they're doing right now. The other thing that occurs is that what you're saying, uh, brings to light the importance not just of history but of culture, because there are deep intuitions that are expressed through the uprisings of the farmers, of the truckers in Canada, of what's going on in France at the moment. But because we are bereft of a certain cultural heritage, those energies can be misappropriated, or they can be then sort of rechanneled by, I don't want to be totally cynical, okay, but when people lack a vocabulary, they can be manipulated, and
Yeah.
and their efforts can be uh, misunderstood, and they sometimes are undisciplined and channeled in problematic ways, and then this actually feeds back into the problem that they're trying to escape. And if you have a sort of a cultural ground, then you have like, what comes to mind is actually like the Black Panther Party in the
Right.
60s. It's successful. Essentially, I would say they were essentially a successful project, and
Absolutely.
they had a sense of cultural ground that doesn't seem to be present in most of the ranks of, say, like so-called Black Lives Matter.
Well,
Um, I mean,
you know,
it's a heterogeneous movement. There are people within it, but on the whole, like it's not, they're apples and oranges really, but
I think that it, the benchmark, or not the benchmark, but the most important presidency was Reagan's. We are still living in the fallout of that Reagan set in motion. He destroyed unions. It was the final nail in the coffin for unions. Unions represented a cultural continuity and a sense of history and purpose. People were proud of their jobs, proud of being part of the union. And then Clinton, and then Bill Clinton. And Thomas Frank did an interview recently, and he said Clinton was the one that perfected the transition of the Democratic Party. It was already moving pretty dramatically in this direction, but he perfected the change in the Democratic Party from the party of unions and blue collar workers, working class in general, into the party of university educated white people. And it was mimicked in the UK with New Labour, Tony Blair. Uh, and and so people were left, they were abandoned, workers were abandoned by the Democratic Party. They had once been the backbone of the Democratic Party, for better or worse. They were left with the choice of this elitist, white, university educated, affluent, sort of 30%, or the Republican Party of reaction, of militarism, although that was something of an illusion because Democrats have always been militaristic. But the optics for the Republican Party was traditional values, business conservatism and the former working class that had been the primary backbone of the Democratic Party were objects of contempt now for both parties, and were left with no viable choice. And so today in Europe, there's not a single party in any country in Europe in which someone can vote electorally represent their opinion that the Ukraine-Russia conflict is wrong. There's not a single party that is anti-US and NATO. You can't find one. This is why the protests, in a certain sense, are inarticulate, because these are not political scientists or theorists necessarily at all. They understand instinctually, they have a native intelligence that says there is something wrong. I hate all politicians. I hate the system, but I don't know what to do about it. There's no way to rationally vote. The electoral politics is empty, is a complete sort of dog and pony show, a dumb show. And so we are left with protest, but to what end, to what purpose, other than putting food on our families' plates? That's the sort of, on the level of electoral politics, that has been the story. So since Clinton, the Democrats have simply gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. And, we're left now with Joe Biden in his dotage already, who is a longtime gangster, essentially, his coke-addled son. And, Scott Ritter did a wonderful two-part lecture video on Zelensky, on the history of Zelensky and how the US put him in power. Zelensky's vast property holdings, he has mansions all over the world and so forth. Because this was a long time in the planning. And this is where it's, I think, very hard to sit down with someone and explain that you're terrified of being called a conspiracy theorist, but conspiracies exist. Operation Gladio was real. COINTELPRO was real. MK Ultra was real. These are facts. This is historical reality. But most people don't have the patience to sit down and dissect that.
But I think it's deep. I think it's almost primal, the resistance to some of these critiques. People don't want to assimilate the just, this is my view, right? But as I see it, the people in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, these are the worst people on the planet. These people are if there is evil, these are evil people. And the extent of their evil defies exaggeration. People don't want to assimilate the possibility that Barack Obama is a sociopath of extraordinary attainment. But in fact, that is what that despicable individual is. All right. As a person of the radical left, I can tell you Barack Obama is a monster. All right.
Right.
And they also don't want to assimilate the reality of class conflict. I don't even like to think about it sometimes. All right. But the people who occupy the position of capital have incredible class consciousness and solidarity. Yeah. And that's what makes these longer term plannings on their part possible. They are aware that they occupy a position of dominance, which is in fact actually precarious due to the grotesque illegitimacy upon which it's predicated. They're aware of that, and because of that awareness, they will go to great lengths they will plan a century in advance. That's not hyperbole, right? They look out decades. That is not what's happening. People, don't think in terms of decades, right? They might think in terms of getting an additional dollar appended to the minimum wage, right? They are fighting for scraps,
Yeah.
and that's not where the game is to be played, right? But it's incredibly psychologically uncomfortable to try and confront the reality of the world's evil, because it's going to fly in the face of so many stories we were all told as children. It entails an incredibly profound disillusionment, and I don't even care, like, bring that disillusionment to people, right? And it's
Right.
hard, but I mean, that's how I see it. Like, I
Well,
don't.
no, but it's true. I mean, it's interesting because under Obama, the transference of wealth, I've said this many times, was accelerated and virtually completed. The transference of wealth to the top 1%. That was Obama's great achievement, and never mind drone assassinations and by the 1%, and he helped facilitate that. And that's and that's where we are today. Whatever the world is controlled by transnational NGOs, unelected billionaires, foundations, and the politicians are figureheads and symbols of whatever, and people get very excised about it. And every 4 years, there's this orgy of empty debate. And because nothing ever changes, it doesn't matter who becomes president, because they don't really have the power. The power is in BlackRock and Vanguard. The power is the various influential think tanks in DC, or the giant NGOs, giant mining corporations, the defense industry, big pharma, big agri. These people control the world. They essentially make policy. And the COVID phenomenon was the first cover story, and they managed to destroy national economies. It was a retail, somebody's a retail apocalypse. Mom and pop stores closed, museums closed, or were bought up by corporate franchises. And people, this normalizing of rule by diktat took place. People were conditioned to accept uh,
So
no debate, no transparency, no anything, and dissent became poison. Dissent was stigmatized, and that was that.
This is, and I'm afraid we're gonna have to wrap it up, I'm afraid, relatively soon, unfortunately, because it just seems like we're just opening up to stuff, right? But because where this conversation feels like it's going to me is in, like, okay, this is where we are. So, like, so now, like, what is to be done? Okay. And it seems now that, like, when you confront that question, you have to look at truly subversive projects. And that is true on multiple planes. It's true in terms of a cultural reawakening that reanimates the significance of the local, but you have to be very careful about that, because you can sort of get lost in a sort of provincialism. But you also have to look at a radical revision of capital itself. This is all, like, way too much to talk about at this moment. But
well, I will
the one thing
say, go ahead, and then I've got one final thought, and we'll wrap it up.
And that is, like, we talk about the past few years and the events, the COVID phenomenon, whatever. I don't even like using that word. It's like it's okay. Well, to what extent do people really sort of, like, drink that Kool-Aid? Okay, it's actually a somewhat open question. There are a lot of people who did, all right, but I think that there's a non-trivial minority which saw through the illusion relatively early on, and it grew. Okay, so now we're at like this impasse where I think that there is a narrative which is being put forth that tries to misrepresent the actual terrain of contest, where the extent to which people are captured. But this actually harkens back to a point that I think you brought up. It's hard for someone like yourself or myself to really judge, because being very dissident, I'm drawn to sort of communities of dissidents, and then I become astonished when I encounter, like, in, a more ordinary, quote unquote ordinary person, right? I'm sure you understand what I mean, that they have just gone along with certain aspects of the broader discourse that I just assumed. Well, you still believe
No,
that? Then you get the memo, right? And it's just, it's that's sort of like the sort of concluding question. I was going to ask you about that, this issue of trying to discern the relative degrees to which people at large have been effectively snowed by the
well,
narrative, or
yeah,
ineffective.
okay. So my final thought then is, because I think this is a very important point, and I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. There is a not insignificant minority, but I'm only assuming it's a minority, of people who saw through it, saw through the lies, understood the lockdowns were bogus, that this was not about health, it was political, who understood the vaccines were bullshit, if not outright harmful, et cetera, et cetera. They also understand that the US is an imperialist machine that manufactures inequality, and uh, but they feel helpless. They're not sure what to do. I know people who didn't want to lose their jobs, so they put on masks and they shut up. They didn't say anything because they didn't want to be called a conspiracy theorist. All of this stuff, but there's a lot of people who understood this. They maybe can't articulate uh, or engage in a nuanced dissection of the history that preceded this, but that's irrelevant. I think, though, that on one level, my sense is that power is so consolidated today that the idea of organizing anything that resembles a revolution is pointless on the level that we normally think of as like revolutionary change. I think it's going to start at a grassroots level with education, with pedagogy, with slowly trying to teach people this is what has happened, to work on the importance of culture. And this takes me back to the Carthusian monks, and that to understand the beauty of that, to understand what that is, to understand why Cro-Magnon man painted on the cave walls, and why that still 30,000 years later has importance and significance to us, to some of us. To understand that uh, is the beginning of some kind of change. I just think it's going to take a long time, because there's certainly no democratic process that's going to effectively change anything. But dissent will happen in the cultural realm and in the educational realm, and it will be incremental and small, but I don't think that means it will be insignificant. I think that's
No,
the direction it has to go.
I think that see, then that's also humbling, recognizing that the project in front of us is a generational project.
Yeah,
It's, like cathedrals are built over generations. And so it involves re-entering the sense of time in our relationship with the world, which has been forgotten.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right.
I think that that might be just a good point at which to leave off for the moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. It's always really fun.
Yes, thank you. Maybe we can
Fun
tackle.
may not be the correct word, but
Yeah.
enjoyable anyway,
Well,
satisfying.
There's got to be a little bit of play, right? If you can't
Yeah,
dance,
yeah.
it's not your revolution. So to paraphrase.
All right, man.
Hey,
Thank you.
Thank you, and you have a good rest of your day.
You too.
I'll talk to you soon. Bye.